Hi, my name is Jenny Rosen, Senior Development Executive at DramaBox, and I also am a vertical drama screenwriter and traditional writer. So yes, that's my role in the industry, and I've been working in verticals for nearly 2 years. Yeah.
How did you first get involved in short dramas?
Yes, so essentially I started out in the web novel world on Wattpad, and I had some successful books on Wattpad for the young adult audience. I loved young adult contemporary, I loved young adult romance, and the books went viral fairly early on. And so that led to me getting a publishing deal through Hachette Audio, and then a mobile game adaptation through Crazy Maple Studios. And that was in 2017 when they were fairly new. So it's very exciting to see them adapt one of my successful web novel series into a mobile game. And then fast forward many years later, I was on set working in camera department on a shoot for ReelShort. And it turned out that one of the team members who had adapted my book many years before was working and was there representing client. I started out on Wattpad because I actually wanted to test a manuscript that I had written to see if the young adult market was actually going to respond. I said, I don't have any data, so it makes no sense to try to approach publishers unless I see if it really works for the audience. And then maybe I can write a draft based on their feedback that will give me a better sense of what they want as an audience. So I've always been very like data interested and data driven. Get feedback and comments from the fans. It used to be a very big culture on the Wattpad website where people could comment in real time on you'd upload a chapter and you'd see feedback right away and you would know, oh, did this not work? Did they really like this? Was the cliffhanger strong enough? So you were getting these conversations from readers, and their responses really told you like, okay, this chapter worked really well. Maybe this was too long. You just got a better sense of pacing for the platform.
How will you define short dramas, and what do you think it's their essence?
For me, I think short dramas are an invitation to escape. I think they're emotional escapism. And they're also the science of dopamine. It is very clear that there's a opportunity for our audience members to turn off their brain a little bit, experience something emotional, but then also feel that pull and that sort of fun addiction to continuing to have to find out what happens to these characters. Like we're inviting them on like an emotional journey. So we promise that they're going to feel good at the end of this drama. What we promise them at the start, we are going to deliver at the end. We always deliver on the premise of the promise. We're not asking them to work out grand mysteries or really get very deep into like characterization and trauma. We're not doing that. This is a place where you get to be emotionally satisfied, and there's a very clear point of connection. So I think in verticals, it's fun because we have the opportunity to create characters that people can root for, people feel bad for, people can see themselves in some regard or something that they're missing in their own lives. And it's the fantasy. So I think it's what the essence of vertical drama is, that emotional escapism and wish fulfillment.
How do you design a story or a character that the audience root for?
Usually, right at the top, it's someone who we know is fully good, someone who means well in the world and is often misunderstood or taken advantage of. Injustice is the biggest trigger in a vertical drama. When you see a very good, hardworking person who not small people can relate to, small groups of people, but who everyone can see a little bit of themselves in this person. And when you know they're good and they're honest and then they're betrayed or somebody, they're cheated on or something really inflammatory, I like to create characters where you say, listen, I'm going to root for this person all the way, and I'm not going to stop watching until I know that sort of justice has been done. Yeah, I think it's just making someone relatable and someone who you can, their problems are things that you can relate to, but you see them overcome.
What are the key differences between short dramas and other forms such as films and TVs?
I think for film and television, we really focus intensely on character. We focus on really building an extremely complicated, immersive, rich backstory. And it's really about how they move and grow over the course of their journey in the film or in a television show. But in vertical dramas, we aren't asking as much of our audience. We have characters that don't really have loads of dynamic change. We'll see them They do change and grow over the course of the, but it's not in a drastic way. We know they're good from the beginning. They're going to stay that good person, but maybe they gain a little bit more confidence. Like we don't ask as much of them. So I think of film and television, it's closer to Rubik's Cube, something that's complicated that you want to sit down and work with, and it's much slower burn. Vertical dramas offer like instant gratification, and it's for everyone. It's not a TV show where you're going to feel like, oh, I don't understand this, or I can't really relate to this. It's something that everybody, there's core emotional sort of pain points that everyone can relate to. And vertical dramas really speak to those. They speak to the majority of people.
When you write your own script, how do you choose topics? And where do you usually find inspiration?
When I first started in vertical dramas, I had a lot of topics was the topics I would write about was really informed by data of what we knew was performing well. And then it was like, oh, we know these topics are doing well. Pick one that you think is interesting to you. And I always love, of course, my go-tos if we have enemies to lovers at any point in time or second chance romance. I think those are fun for me. But a lot of things were assigned, or hey, we're going to try to explore or experiment in this direction. Why don't you try doing this? Let's try doing something different that hasn't really been seen in the vertical space. So I got to do some experimental verticals that sort of like pushed the boundaries or moved in a different direction to sort of test where if our audiences were interested in it. And then inspiration for verticals when I got into doing verticals that were less assigned and things I could really build from scratch. I would really look to friends and family members, sort of personal experiences, people who I've known in my life who have these really dynamic stories or dynamic ways of speaking, and bringing them into the vertical space where you start thinking, what does the vertical version of this person in my life look like? And how can we sort of recreate them or reinvent them for the vertical world? I really enjoy doing that.
You were mentioning about experimenting different topics. Why do you think those topics can be experienced?
Those were things that we were trying to see. Let's, for example, Pride and Prejudice was a really fun experiment because at the time there really hadn't been any adaptations of classics at all. I was an English major. I was very much involved in the classic world and being able to go back and say, how can I take something that's such a widely loved and known topic and or classic and then turn it into something that works for the vertical audience? And that was a challenge. There were certain things that worked really well. There were certain things that didn't. And it was a great experiment to see when we're trying to expand into different genres or types or adaptations, what works for the audience and what doesn't, and what did we learn. So I think that was really fun to just, I got chosen for that project and it was really, I enjoyed it. I really had a great time, but it was interesting seeing like, okay, now we know what did we learn and how can that inform our filmmaking in verticals moving forward.
About the designing our characters, you find inspiration from real life. Is there anything you else want to share when you design your characters?
You have to find people who strike an emotional chord right away in your audience. You're designing characters that come with a lot of emotional. It's not weight, but it's a very powerful first impression. It's somebody who you understand right at first glance. I understand this is this type of person. I recently did a show called The CEO and the Country Girl, and the main character is someone who's working. She's a very hardworking, earnest young woman, and she's struggling because she's just lost her father and she has to manage a farm by herself. And she's the type where she says, I don't need any help. I'm okay. I don't need anybody, but she would like someone to be there to help support her because it's very difficult on her own. So she meets someone who's also able to, a CEO comes in and helps actually become a very unlikely partner. So they build their romance and they also build their trust and relationship sort of parallel to each other, and then they figure out all the places where they don't get along and where they do and they come together. So I like showing characters who are very earnest. I look for the hardworking, everyday person who often gets forgotten in mainstream media. And I like to pull those types of characters into the spotlight in verticals because that's really who I think doesn't get the spotlight enough.
What do you mean by they were not in the mainstream media?
When we go to the movies nowadays, for the most part, film and television, but a lot of it doesn't feel relatable. We see characters in situations and in worlds, and certainly in mainstream Hollywood, that just are not. things that most everyday people are experiencing or can connect to. There's moments, but a lot of it is filmmakers within the Hollywood sphere making films for the coasts, making films for people and our friends. It's more of what will my peers think about me, not like, are we making this film to where most of America can relate to it, can enjoy it, can feel something. So I think there's been a big disconnect between who we write films for and what audiences that we're trying to serve. And I think we've missed the middle, right? We have these audiences who are the film audiences and really enjoy films and are very immersed in films. And then there's people who don't care about them at all. And then we miss the whole middle point who families, everyday people just don't feel like movies pull them in the same way anymore. So I think that we're missing a huge portion of our country and we're not serving them. And I think vertical dramas are one of the first platform areas to actually serve the quiet middle. I think we're missing them.
Yeah, can you give me an example of what films are portrayed? What kind of characters some films portrayed in the US?
I saw Caught Stealing, which was a really wonderful Darren Aronofsky film. And the characters were really dynamic and fun, but it wasn't necessarily something that I feel that many people were could relate to. Being chased around by thugs, like it's fun to watch. It's super entertaining, and we relate to the fact that the main character was an athlete who got injured and can't do that anymore. That was very relatable. But the circumstances that they get into is not it's fun and it's really enjoyable to go along for the ride, but it's not something where people can say like, yeah, this is something that I can relate to in my everyday because not many of us are being chased by criminals and stuff like that. And those are not meant to necessarily be one to one, but for example, a lot of movies in the 90s, I watched Sister Act 2 the other day, which was really fun. And it was just a simple story about a school that was in trouble and they were about to close. And there's a lot of wonderful kids who have musical talent, but they don't believe in themselves. Their lives are difficult. And a teacher comes in and she makes all the difference in them believing in themselves and they save their school. That's a feel-good story for everybody. We don't really have this very often anymore. A lot of stuff is very dark. So I think that's sort of been the gap. A lot of films, a lot of television. We look at Alien Earth, beautiful, amazing, but really dark. But like we're missing sort of that point of feel good, escapist moments in film and TV. And I think vertical dramas are allowing a certain subsect of the audience to go back to that.
There are a lot of CEO romance stories, and those CEOs and billionaires, they're not a person you can reach out in real life. How does that relate it to the audience?
I think the CEO billionaire romances are popular, not because women are like, oh, my dream is to have a billionaire husband. Real life billionaires are nothing like what we have in vertical dramas at all. But it is the idea of security. It's the idea of somebody who can, it's the Cinderella story of somebody who can step in and provide and really be in charge of what he has created and sort of, a woman gets the opportunity to be taken care of in some degree. And I think there's a pain point underneath that where some women feel like, well, in my marriage, I don't feel like it's an equal partnership, or sometimes I want to be pampered, and sometimes I want to feel protected, taken care of, and sometimes I feel like I have to do everything myself. And so the CEO is very much like the prince in all of the fairy tales, right? Everyday girl is really struggling, like Cinderella, and she's not treated well by her family. Nowadays, we could say, oh, you're not being treated well at work, maybe your family, maybe people around you. No one sees your true value, but then someone of high status sees your value and validates your existence. So that kind of interesting fairy tale moment of just being able to feel seen and to feel secure is what's underneath that driving CEO romance. It is not because it's not even to even go back on feminist things where women are saying, "Oh, we have to have a CEO, a powerful man to take care of us." It's not that, but I think it does represent something very deeply rooted underneath, which is that feeling of wanting to escape of the prince figure that we've all grown up reading and hearing about. So I think that's what is underneath that.
Well, you mentioned about verticals are representing some people that were out of the mainstream or they are not portrayed in main media in the big
Mhm.
films. You mean the ordinary people, they're the female leads.
Very much so. Also, like the leads themselves, I like the female leads who sort of feel like the every girl, but also the romance audience is not served at all in mainstream media for the most part. Romance is one of the most underserved in the sort of film community. There's not many romance films, there's not many rom-coms anymore. There's a couple, and they're coming out of platforms like Webtoon and web novel platforms like Wattpad. Wattpad has been a humongous sort of provider of romantic films and young adult films, early adult romance. Colleen Hoover is a massively successful romance writer. She only just has started to bring her films into sort of the mainstream film and TV media space, but romance is the most lucrative category genre in publishing. And the amount of movies to support it or meet that need is nowhere near um, what it could be. So I think that's the audience that's being underserved, like women in general, because Hollywood is not really catered towards, it's not female gaze. That's a major thing about verticals that changed the game, is that like it is female, it is through the female gaze. It is not male gaze, which is what Hollywood has been forever. It's something that's actually taking in our fantasies, our wants, our experiences, and putting them into a television show, or I guess a vertical drama, in a way that Hollywood has ignored for a very long time.
In most of films, the audience
Mhm.
experiencing something they never experienced in their real life. Does it happen
Mhm.
in verticals? They're experiencing
Well,
something that
there's things in verticals where there's a lot of things in verticals where like this clearly would never happen. But I think the difference is, for example, I'm not going to fall down a flight of stairs and have a CEO catch me. Maybe that will happen. That would be really cool, but I don't think that's going to happen in my everyday life. But what's fun about verticals and what's different about verticals, I think, for the audiences is that it is that fantasy moment that everyone sort of has, that it's a dream, right? The prince finds you and finds your glass slipper. That's what that fantasy is. The CEO is the one who steps in for you when everyone is treating you badly. Or a woman whose identity, and she's a secret billionaire and everyone doubts her authenticity, and then she's able to show everybody and punish all of her enemies. That is a fantasy of, I will have finally, after being disrespected, I will finally earn respect. After being bullied, I can finally put the bullies in their place and rise into the right, to where I belong, and get earn respect and punish the people who disrespect me. So things like that are fantasies, and we play them out in ways that are not necessarily this is real life, but that's why they're fun, because you can escape. It's a parody of real life. And so that's what makes it, I think, very engaging. It doesn't feel too close, but we can relate to it and still have fun.
in the films, that film you mentioned, that the guy or the male lead or female lead is chased by thugs, right? It's not something that happen in real life, but what about in verticals?
Yeah. Well, we have things that are not realistic, absolutely. But I think because it's certainly in the romance category, because romance is sort of the main driver, that's where, because we're not, most people are not running into CEOs or being swept away. But I think when romance is sort of at the basis of that, or a basis of the vertical genre, there's still that fantasy element where people can say, yes, I'm an everyday girl. Maybe the main girl is a cleaning woman, or maybe she works at a grocery store, or maybe she's a really good daughter and her family treats her badly. That is relatable. How she ends up falling for the CEO or what happens to her may not be. The level of like abuse is not realistic. It's sort of campy at best, but I think that the realistic elements is the emotional truth of the main character's circumstances, which is like, this is someone who's not seen, or someone who's not respected, or someone who's not heard, and they get an opportunity to finally achieve those things.
How do you capture the audience attention in the first set 10 seconds?
You start right in the middle of a conflict. You have to get started immediately. We don't waste much time with setup. The setup has to be instant, and the conflict needs to be very clear. When you use things like injustice, when you use things like infidelity, when you use sort of devices that are a character being done wrong, something shocking happening right off the bat, someone being thrown out, disrespected, bullied, or someone simply just finding themselves down on their luck in a really dramatic way. It has to be very high drama, high stakes, and high tension. We don't really have the luxury of time to slowly build into something. We have to throw our audience in right away and shock them to stop them from scrolling past. And then we continue to escalate from there.
Can you give me a more example? What kind of thing is in the middle of a conflict?
Yes. For example, I'll use an example from one of the shows that I was working on. Was my main character was writing back, and she was going to celebrate her anniversary with her boyfriend, and decides to walk in and walks in on him cheating with her sister right away. So she is excited about being able to have their anniversary, and she finds out their anniversary is ruined, and then she picks up a shotgun off the wall and points it at him. So it's something that escalates very quickly. We have the infidelity, we have the hurt and the wrong, and he and the girl are not remorseful at all. So again, tapping into that frustration, how could they do this to her, and what is she going to do about it? It's moments like those that I think really help cement the audience into the show in the first 5 to 10 seconds.
I also want to add one more question based on the character design. So, do you think the main character should be 2 or 3 dimension? And what about the supporting characters?
I think your main character, we're seeing an interesting sort of shift. The American audience seems to, there's a want from fans to have characters that have more dimension. So I do think that if you can explore giving characters a bit more dimension, but still following sort of the vertical rules to where they're not so multidimensional that they become difficult to follow, or it just becomes over complex to where that complicates the plot, that complicates the relationships around them. We still need to keep a level of simplicity that doesn't alienate audiences. Yeah, I think that there's the balance of finding out what works for audiences. What does the data say? And you can look at vertical dramas that have explored deeper character arcs, and you have to look at that performance versus ones that explore it less. See where does it seem to be more successful. Sometimes people find a middle ground. But I think it depends on what audience you're serving and who you're trying to reach.
Hi, this is Maggie Han. Want to write short drama but feel like you can't because you are not a filmmaker. The truth is, short drama can be learned. And in China, where the short drama market makes over 7 billion US dollar a year, a lot of hits actually come from everyday people. In my course, Short Drama Writing 101, I will show you the method. One protagonist, one main task, one simple storyline. You can preview the lesson for free and start creating with us. You mean the main character should have more dimensions, or the supporting characters should be also have more dimensions?
I think supporting characters have to have less dimension because you can't spend enough time with them to be able to give them a lot of dimension. I think your main characters, sometimes it works really well when they're one-dimensional. We have had many vertical dramas where they're not super dimensional, and there are some where you give them a bit more and they're also successful. So I think, again, like it depends on who you're serving, and it depends on what data sort of dictates works and what doesn't. But again, if you're working in for example, the more indie space in verticals, like you have a lot more freedom to give characters explore that dimension. The main character is way more dimension. But in sort of the mainstream vertical space, I think there's a lot less room for that. Hopefully there'll be more, but we're approaching it slowly.
How do you use data?
Data is really important in the process of being able to recognize what, if you have access to it, which is a privilege, what worked in your show, what did the audience respond to, what did you do well and successfully, and what did they not respond to? Did your show keep them all the way through? Where did they leave the show? Did you sort of lose their attention halfway? Did you get them to the paywall? That's very important. Like, did you get them to the point where they really want to pay for the full show? Was the opening of the show enough to bring them into the show and get their attention? Because there's so many verticals. They have hundreds of thousands of verticals to choose from. Did you strike a chord right away at the top and get them into the show? So you use that information to help improve your writing for the next verticals that you do. If you find out like, okay, so my audience, there was a lot of people there at the beginning, but they didn't go to the paywall. That means that I took too long with the setups, or it was too complicated, or I didn't keep their interest. So I need to work on really mastering my first 10. I didn't do a great job with the ad creatives. I need to do stronger ad creative moments in the first pre-paywall episodes. Or if you get them past the paywall and they disappear after that, I need to do a better job of making my story more compelling and stronger so that we keep people in the show all the way to the end. So you can use it to directly understand where you need to finesse your writing technique.
I know from the platform perspective, you can see many people are past the paywall or the completion rate. How do you see people are liking this show or not? Because even people are keep watching
Mhm.
this. Some Chinese short dramas, they keep you very angry. So the audience will keep watching that. But maybe they don't enjoy, they're just so angry, so they're very unconscious. They just keep watching until I just want to watch the end. So how do you know
Right.
people like it or not? Is from social media feedback or what?
I think Jen Cooper has started a platform on Instagram, and they have a website, Vertical Drama Love, and it was the first place where my friend sent it to me, and she was like, "Hey, they reviewed your show," which was really exciting. And then I saw that it was the first place that really gathered vertical fans in a place and gave them an opportunity to openly discuss what they thought about shows. And then other reviewers popped up. There's a lot of other reviewing Instagram accounts. There are some people on influencers on TikTok just for fun will go and comment on what they thought about a vertical show. So I think um, we obviously focus a lot on data, but I think we also have to put equal importance on the fan response because we can have a successful show that makes people really upset and that they really don't like, but it got numbers maybe because it was, like you said, it was shocking or it made them angry. But I think looking at reviews, looking at the comments of what people are saying, how they're responding is really important because like we have to keep ourselves aware of how our audiences are actively feeling about our shows. You can have a successful show that really many people strongly dislike, but the numbers won't show that, but the conversations will. So I think you have to pay attention to both. And I think we need to do more of really including fans in the conversation for our shows.
I'm also going to interview Jen Cooper next week, actually. So
Yay.
also I think it's a good way to build your brain, right, as drama box. Because if one show is successful, people are paying that, but they don't
Mhm.
like your show, they'll probably not stay in your platform, right?
And so that's important. So again, I think really exploring fan responses to shows is a newer avenue, but I'm really passionate about that because that's the world that I came from at Wattpad. Everything was the fans' conversation. You knew exactly what people thought about your story, and there was nowhere to hide. And it was really important to have that information, even though um, it may have great numbers, they may not be happy, or maybe you lose your audience halfway through, or I think we have to sort of to also break into the American market and understand how do we continue to expand. We have to also know, are we appealing, are some of the themes that we're bringing in dramas that are from overseas, does that work for the Western audience or not? So looking at the fans, reading their comments, some of the comments are really detailed and very, very thoughtful, are really important for, I think, our overall content strategy.
What's the fans' feedback? What kind of content they like and what kind of content they dislike? Can you give me an example?
Oh yes, the fans love content with really genuinely strong heroines. They love a strong female lead. They do not like the weak, constantly dependent damsel who can't do anything for herself and is always waiting to be rescued. They like, obviously seeing somebody step in to do, if there's the love interest and he comes in and helps her. But if she just feels helpless and she has no agency, that is something that American audiences really dislike. They also dislike abuse, dramas that involve incredible misogyny, physical abuse of the disabled. Those are horrific, and those have sparked many conversations within the creative community and within the fan community about where do we draw the line, because some of those themes are eye-catching and they're great for numbers, but they are unacceptable to us culturally. So that is a major conversation. I've spoken to many creatives who say, listen, I don't want to be a part of dramas that are going to be doing these themes. So that's a very important thing for the future of vertical dramas. We have to pay attention to where we culturally are aligning and where we are crossing lines.
If something we mentioned about that's called shock value, because short dramas or verticals are driven by ad
Hmm.
acquisition. And how do you track people's attention while not giving too much violence or that? How do you have the shock value?
That's the grand question of how do we do that the right way. I think there are ways to tell stories that are just as shocking without having to resort to really attacking certain groups of people. We can tell a shocking story without having to, beat up a disabled person. We don't, that's horrible. We don't need to do that. That is low hanging, I want to call it low hanging fruit. That's clickbait, and I understand its mechanism and I understand why it works, but it is not something that we have to do. You can tell a story by showing somebody in a situation where they're being discriminated against or they're being mistreated. It doesn't have to involve, because there's shows that don't involve that at all that are equally successful. I think it's about how you approach it, and I think it just takes a bit more consciousness. Um, but I think we have to be very careful in terms of saying we're going to do this, what lines are we willing to cross to get people into the shows? It's complicated. Sometimes you do have to cross those lines. I've seen it happen. And you have to also pay attention to how fans are responding. So I think if there's a shift where we see that audiences are not engaging the way they used to with shock value dramas, that's when I hope it'll sort of work from the ground up, where they say, obviously, this type of CPI moment isn't working anymore, or it sparked a very negative conversation or negative press. That I think will make a bigger impact. So I'm hoping we can move away from things like that.
Right. And how do you design your hooks and what makes a good hook?
I think what makes a good hook is something where you have an unanswered question, always an unanswered question, or you leave sort of that need to be fulfilled in the audience member's mind. I have to know what's going to happen next. You leave something unresolved or you don't answer a question. You always have to, it's very much like music where you have an unresolved chord. It bothers people subconsciously, even though they don't know it. They're like, why isn't it resolving? So continuing to pull people in by ramping up to very high emotional stakes, and leaving things off at a point where you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so it's always pushing away that promise of the premise until we get to the end. We don't deliver on the core expectation until we close out the story. So I think it's always keeping it like the carrot. You keep it just out of reach for the audience. Yeah.
I want to add more question about pacing. We will always say China pacing is very important. How do you design pacing in verticals?
We essentially just move as quickly as we can. It's really about like speed and efficiency, but also making sure that while you're moving quickly, you're still telling a properly structured story. You can't move really fast and then all the details sort of fall off and no one understands what's going on. You have to be able to balance it to where anyone could pick up your script. And I think when you've accomplished good pacing, somebody could pick up your script and watch your show and they go, oh, wow, it's over. It didn't feel that long. I think that's a great marker of solid pacing. When you've done a bad job with pacing, I could be like episode 3 and I'm like, what? This isn't 20? How why is this taking so long? So I think it's the way in which your audience and even other creatives, if you give them your script or tell them to watch your show, do they feel like it was a long period of time that passed? Did it feel like the story kept moving and the stakes kept them interested? I think it's how does your audience experience time in the story that you've created? And you have to structure it so they don't feel the time.
About structure, because I've been asked, some people just ask me how to design the structure. I know it's a little bit difficult question. How do you design the structure of the whole vertical of a story?
Oh, that's very detailed. This is a complicated process. So essentially, really starting out with a beat sheet, a very clear beat by beat breakdown of the entire show. And then understanding, like outlining what are my CPI moments? What are those really clear ad moments, and really focusing on the first 20 episodes to ensure that we are really hitting data proven CPI moments that are going to bother, frustrate, interest the audience, pique their curiosity. I'm in outlining those. So I'll usually have like a spreadsheet where you can see here's the summary of what I'm going to do for my episode, and I outline where else are we going emotionally? What do I want the audience to feel? And then once I work on that with my team, and we say, yes, this looks great, let's go to script. Then the writing of the show really actually happens during the outline beat sheet phase for me. Because once you know that's approved and once you know that that's going to work, scripting it is really fast because you already know what you're going to do because the conversations, the dialogue for me are already there. That's the easiest part for me is the conversation. So the most difficult part is making sure that the marketing area verticals and the setup and getting those first 20 excellent is the most important. I'm still learning a lot. I've done a lot wrong. When I started, I was doing it all wrong, and it's really a learning process. But hopefully now I have a much better understanding of how to structure that. But really, for me, the building out of the show all happens at the beat sheet outline stage.
I'm just curious, why 20 episodes? I thought the first 10 or 15 are the free episodes. Why you have to build the 20 episodes?
Because usually when you have really strong drivers, it gives your teams more options for CPI moments that they can show, gives them more options, which is great. Also, I think the first 20, we really focus on obviously pre-paywall episodes. Those are the gold. But first 20, if you're really mastering the episodes after the paywall, it doesn't help you if they leave. If you have really good pre-paywall and then they pay and then they're like, this isn't very good and I'm only on episode 15. I think in the viewer's mind, when you hit 20 and the story's still good and the pacing is still strong, they're way more inclined to finish and go all the way through than if you just die right after an episode, your paywall. And because paywalls keep changing, you have to go a lot further. And I think 20 is a nice marker point, just script wise, of being able to say, yep, these are really solid. And that should propel the reader or the viewer to keep going for the whole show. I guess it
Normally in
depends.
China, for 65 episodes, our paywall is around 12 to 15.
Mm,
So you can
yeah,
either cut off and 15. You can build up the whole emotional, I would say emotional arc until the 15 or 13 or something. In the middle of that, you cut it. And so the audience is so eager to see what's going to happen next.
that's where I've seen it lately, but I've seen some paywalls on different platforms where it's really early, and you're like, oh, but I guess it depends on how they structure the story because sometimes that works.
Normally, how many episodes will you suggest people to write?
Well, this is a conversation that a lot of writers will have where I was used to doing the standard like, 70 to 80. But I actually, as a viewer, watching shows and studying what shows I feel like this worked really well, I've actually found that I doing shows that have anywhere between 50 to 60 episodes are stronger because you don't have to extend uh the plot past the point where you feel like it's really going to work. I think when we get to 70, 80 episodes, because of the nature of how the short drama episodes are structured and they have to be so high stakes all the time, the story begins to unravel a little bit. And there are many writers who talk about this. They're like, it's much easier and it's much better. I feel like I'm writing better shows when I do it less episodes. Because it just allows me to keep the story much more contained and you don't have to extend so much of the drama as long, like kind of past the point where it seems really succinct and well put together. So the average I know is 70 to 80, but I've seen a lot of different platforms experimenting with doing shorter shows. Yeah, like
Mhm.
50s or so.
And in North America, Vertical is still dominated by CEO romance stories. And what other type of story do you think could be explored and why?
I really would love horror to be explored because horror is a really natural fit for the vertical space. Because I like sort of the romance setups. Horror also doesn't require much. You can get people into a story. You can do setups very quickly. You can have really engaging cliffs that are frightening and keep people engaged without having to do a lot of building. Characters can just exist and be thrown into circumstances. So I would love to see the horror genre enter the vertical space. I don't know if we can really combine the worlds of romance fans who are the majority of our vertical viewers with horror. I know there have been attempts and it doesn't seem to go very well, but I think if there were platforms that were dedicated to horror specifically, like this platform is for vertical horror fans, that would be a different discussion. I think that'd be interesting to explore because we're not trying to mix audiences. We are catering to two separate fan bases where they are. So I think that would be interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, maybe horror can expand audience
Yes.
category. In China, like half female audience, half male audience, actually. We have a strong male-oriented stories. And how do you see the male-oriented story in vertical space? I know it's haven't been explored yet.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other day. Is that been a very few. They're still mostly geared towards women, but the male-oriented stories are really ones where sort of like Watch Out, I'm the Final Boss. They usually are in revenge or hidden identity, hidden billionaire, like someone who appears to be weak and is secretly strong. And I think that does appeal to male audiences in the sense that it's just like, status is very important to them and being valued by their significant other, by their family, by their peers is really important. And I think if we're, Real Short had a great show, I think it was The Lost Quarterback, which was male oriented, and it did because it involves sports. So I think for US audiences, there has to be a sports tie-in to some degree. That's a great way to sort of bring in male viewers. The tricky thing is, I don't know, I think it's more brand association, where for guys, when they think about vertical dramas, they think romance, they think werewolf CEO billionaires. They don't think it's for them. So that's not really where they're going to spend their time. It would be something where it's like, I don't want to be caught watching a vertical drama. Like I'm not, I think that's not, it feels like it's not for them, but creating content where that appeals to men, I guess that appeals to the fantasies and the pain points that they have, like that would sort of exist in its own space. I don't know if at this point we will bring male viewers in record numbers into a platform that is largely like dominated by romance, female gaze romance. It's just not for them. So I think that's the tricky part is like, do you create a separate space? Is it another platform or another version of your platform that is specifically for guys? Is it branded differently? I think those are some of the questions because I think if we're going to pitch it to the American male audience, it has to feel like it was made for them, not like, oh, we just added a couple things and you're going to join us. Yeah, we need
That's
something that.
a very interesting point. It's like Lululemon. Right? I think a lot of guys think Lululemon is for female. I don't buy this, although I think it's good stuff. I don't buy it, right?
Like, I wonder if it'll be like TV with cable, where it's like we know that like most of the guys probably are watching ESPN, and because they get to watch sports and that's what they enjoy, and they know that when they go to ESPN, that we know that that's mostly male targeted programming. But like, how do we create that, but in a drama form for guys? I don't know if it's on the same platform or if we need to make a separate universe for that, but still works the same way. But it's just clearly this is male oriented content. I don't know. America may have to be that type of split.
Short drama started in China. First round was male-oriented stories.
Yeah.
So that was never meant to shoot for women, and then they expanded to families, to females in bigger cities. So that's a
Hmm.
completely different way. In the US, it's expand in male female audience first. So a lot of
Yeah.
people maybe they know about short drama, they just think it's for female, just for
I
love
do.
story.
Yeah, America's big on brand association. So if they see an article that says, and they see like a picture of like a romance type of cover, and it's got a pink background, that doesn't say that this is male-oriented content, for like it just doesn't speak, like the branding doesn't look like it's something that's for them. So I think somebody has to be the platform that creates a space that is like, this is all content that is specifically catering to that audience. So they know, oh, I can go and watch this. And it's not something where they're like, I'm also watching like billionaire romance. Like I think that they just have to separate the two worlds.
How do you feel see the future of short drama?
I'm really excited to see how the American market manages like genre expansion. because everyone wants to do something. Everyone wants to do a new genre. Everyone was like, "Oh, can we do horror? Can we do thriller?" I know in China it's like amazing crime thrillers and all kinds of really exciting dramas that are being done that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface because we don't know how to, again, like how do we bring those audiences into this space, and how do we experiment and we try a new genre and it doesn't work. How do we crack the code? Do we keep at it until we figure it out? That's very much of the American way. Or do we just stick with what the data says is safe? Like that's sort of the difficulty is that American audiences really want to get into, and the American, platform makers are really looking to explore how do we become the platform where people go to us for how do we become that? So I think I'm curious to see what is built to serve different genres. If those genres continue to prove unsuccessful on sort of the mainstream platforms, um, will there be who are going to be the platforms that do it and serve their vertical audiences really well in a specific genre? So that's what I'm excited to see.
How do you see AI is gonna change or replace some verticals or scripts or production? How do you see AI in short dramas?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think AI, this idea that like you can I know everyone in the press was like, oh, verticals written by AI. It's like, no, these are written by people. And actually, when they try to write verticals with AI, they're horrific. It just can't, it like you'd be surprised. There's so much that goes into crafting a vertical drama. I know people think it's simple. It is anything but. Um, it needs a lot of guidance. It needs it because these are emotional stories. It needs that human emotional touch, and it needs someone who understands the arc of it. So I think AI could be a tool to help streamline parts of the process to make it simpler. Maybe you could figure out how to help, like a writer could build it into their workflow. We're like, okay, well, I have to come up with I need to shorten my summary, or I need to do, you could find ways to integrate it to make parts of the process, maybe generating pitch decks, simpler. But at the end of the day, I think that there has to be it's never going to be fully in the near future because like, again, you could do AI scripts and if they don't perform, you're back to square one. So it's, trying to figure out, it's not as simple as like once AI cracks the code, it will be able to produce scripts that work every single time. It won't. That's the reality. So I think in production, I've seen AI generated vertical dramas. It's very bizarre. I think one of the most important parts of vertical dramas for fans are those actors. That star power is bringing people to this space. The fandoms, there have been fan pages, like many actor friends of mine are like, there's people who have made fan pages of me and they're really connected to their fans and they're very dedicated to supporting, and they follow the actors to different shows. They see them on different platforms, they'll watch them everywhere. So the human connection is critical for this vertical space. Like what has built the fandom are the faces, that bring these stories to life and bring these fantasies to life. So I think without that and having AI generated talent, it's not the same experience. It's something else, but it's not what fans come for, where you can't actually you have an AI machine. It's not a human who you feel connected to. So I think because it's such an emotional exchange, um, there will be limitations in terms of how far AI can go in the near future. Who knows? But I think for what it is now and why it's successful, I think AI could be an assistant, but it cannot be the full suite.